Welcome to episode 6 of Power Play, where we travel the globe to explore the hard truths of the energy transition. I'm your host, Paul Browning, and today we're zoning in on a tale of two states, California and Texas, to understand their contrasting speeds in embracing this change. In episode 4, we marveled at China's speed in energy transition projects, but back home, there's a fascinating dichotomy. While California is a tech titan that can move faster than anywhere else on Earth, from tech startup to billion-dollar unicorn, when it comes to energy transition, it's one of the toughest places in the world to get a project done. Texas, on the other hand, with its rich history in fossil fuel energy production, is now channeling the efficiency it developed into renewable energy projects. Texas's wind power installations have long exceeded California's, and this year, Texas is set to eclipse California with its solar installations, thanks to its much more streamlined permitting and interconnection processes. And the thing I want to dig into in this episode is the reasons behind this chart. Let's take a minute to think about the data here. A decade ago, when solar panels were more expensive than fossil fuel power, California took a huge head start on Texas by using renewable portfolio standards to force utilities and municipalities to build more renewable power capacity. But now that wind and solar and lithium-ion battery storage have become cheaper than their fossil fuel alternatives in both Texas and California, market forces are driving rapid deployment in both states, and Texas is able to move much faster than California. The reason for this is simple. It takes so long to develop a project in California that there's a limit to how rapidly Californians can add capacity, whereas in Texas, their rapid permitting and interconnect processes give them a much higher speed limit for new project execution. The result is that California is about to be passed by Texas as the U.S.'s energy transition leader, and Texas will add more solar and wind capacity in 2023 than all the other U.S. states combined, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Let's take a minute to let that settle in Sacramento. So what's behind this stark contrast? Well, let's delve into the data and dissect the three bottlenecks California faces: grid upgrades, interconnect queues, and permitting challenges. Texas has invested heavily in its electrical transmission infrastructure, spending $7 billion to connect West Texas wind power to demand from its eastern cities. Texas approved these transmission projects in 2008, and by 2013, they were all in operation. California, meanwhile, has been stalled for almost a decade without significant new transmission projects, and any new transmission projects will take a decade or more to come online. Remember we introduced NEPA in the last episode? Well, some states, including California, also implemented state versions of NEPA, most of which have an acronym that rhymes a bit with NEPA. California's is called CEQA. When it comes to permitting, California's stringent CEQA process adds layers of complexity that Texas, which doesn't have a state equivalent of NEPA, simply bypasses. And to worsen the situation, about 71% of the land in California is owned by either federal, state, or local governments, ensuring that NEPA or CEQA will be triggered for almost every project in California. Whereas in Texas, most land is privately owned, allowing developers to avoid NEPA requirements. Interconnection queues are another major hurdle. In California, it can take over 5 years to navigate the interconnect process, while Texas maintains a steady 2-year wait. The different interconnection frameworks in California and Texas are largely responsible for this disparity. Texas is the only U.S. grid operator to use a connect and manage process that doesn't require network upgrades. Instead, project developers take studies conducted by the grid operator and use them to assess their curtailment risk based on existing infrastructure. These developers then decide whether or not to proceed with their projects, and if they do, they bear the curtailment risk. In 2022, ERCOT curtailed about 9% of utility-scale solar generation and about 5% of wind generation. This process in Texas also avoids costly grid updates to be borne by individual developers. In California, transmission owners and grid operators use an invest and connect interconnection framework. They study a year's worth of interconnect requests at the same time to see whether broad transmission upgrades are needed under stressed conditions to reliably bring planned power plants and storage facilities online at full capacity. Project developers then pay for any needed network upgrades before they connect their project to the grid. This requires much more study by the grid operator and much larger financial commitments from the project developer. Lastly, the local opposition in California tends to be much greater than in Texas. This is due in part because so many of these large energy projects are being built on public lands, and in part because California has a long history of protesting energy infrastructure projects of all kinds. Whereas in Texas, most of these projects are happening on private lands, and Texas has a long history of supporting energy infrastructure projects and having minimal local opposition. So here's the hard truth of episode 6. Without reforms, California is going to become an energy transition laggard rather than an energy transition leader. The Golden State risks falling behind not just Texas, but the global energy race if it doesn't streamline its energy transition processes. Californians must confront these issues not just for the sake of winning some race, but to beat the clock on climate change and to add new power generation fast enough to support new data centers demanded by their booming tech sector as well as their electric vehicle ambitions. Many Californians understand this, and recent legislative efforts to expedite transmission projects in California with State Bill 619 and State Bill 420 were looking pretty promising, until they were vetoed by California Governor Gavin Newsom in October. Well, that's a wrap on episode 6. Join us next time on Power Play as we continue to travel in the United States to unravel the complexities of the global energy landscape. This summer, we'll head to Europe for 3 months, and then we're off to the rest of the world. Until then, I'm Paul Browning, bidding you farewell and reminding you the power for change lies within our grasp.